In Colorado, people decided to bring wolves back to a place where they disappeared nearly a century ago. To make that happen, 25 wild wolves were captured elsewhere, transported across several states and countries, and released into unfamiliar mountains. But the landscape hadn't been empty during those 100 years. Cougars were already living there. And before long, one of the first relocated wolves was found dead. Deep puncture wounds were discovered in its skull, and the main suspect was a cougar. A similar experiment's been running in Washington for much longer, and the outcome is exactly the same. The wolves are dying. Almost all of the wolves that died were alone. But once wolves come together, the balance of power shifts. People didn't simply return another predator to Colorado. They released 25 wolves into the territory of an animal that already knows how to kill them. Now the question is, what'll happen when those lone wolves begin forming packs? Gray wolves once lived throughout most of Colorado, but for decades they were shot, poisoned, and trapped, and by the 1940s, the state's permanent wolf population had disappeared. About 80 years later, people decided to bring them back. The first 10 wolves were captured in Oregon in December 2023. The animals were sedated, examined by veterinarians, fitted with GPS collars, and then they were transported to Colorado and released in the western part of the state. These weren't wolves raised in captivity. Colorado brought in wild animals taken from existing packs. The crate would open, and almost immediately the wolf would find itself alone in completely unfamiliar territory. In January 2025, another 15 wild wolves were captured in British Columbia, Canada, and transported across the border. This brought the total number of wolves to 25. And the relocation effort wasn't supposed to end there. Officials planned to bring in another 10 to 15 wolves each year for several years until Colorado had a population of roughly 30 to 50 animals. After that, the wolves were expected to reproduce on their own. It soon became clear that deer and vast stretches of empty land weren't the only things waiting for the newly arrived wolves in Colorado. One of the first 10 animals released, a young male, was found dead in the spring of 2024. He'd been released in southwestern Colorado on December 18th, but several months later, his tracking collar led wildlife officials far to the north. The wolf's body was sent for examination. Investigators found deep puncture wounds in its skull and concluded that it had died from injuries inflicted by another predator. The main suspect was a cougar. This wolf weighed about 75 pounds and was a completely wild animal from an Oregon pack. But by the time he was killed, he was traveling alone. And lone wolves are particularly vulnerable. This didn't look like a case of a cougar simply finding an animal that was already dead. The wolf was still alive when the two predators encountered each other. And this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Cougars had killed wolves in other states as well. At least 3 such cases had previously been confirmed in Washington and Oregon. In Washington, these attacks were no longer isolated incidents. Since 2013, wildlife officials have confirmed 6 cases in which cougars killed wolves wearing radio collars. At the time, these incidents accounted for nearly 30% of all known natural wolf deaths in the state. In one case, a young female wolf was found on a hillside after being ambushed. The cougar had bitten through her skull, eaten part of the carcass, and then hid it so it could return later. By comparison, over 28 years of monitoring in Yellowstone, researchers documented only 2 such killings. Idaho recorded 2 as well. Washington had already recorded 6. Almost all of the wolves that were killed had been alone at the time of the attack. For a cougar, that makes an important difference. Taking on an entire pack is dangerous, but a lone wolf can be attacked in the cougar's usual way, by creeping close unnoticed and striking from ambush. Scientists still don't know exactly why these incidents happen more often in Washington. The landscape may be part of the explanation. Dense forests, steep slopes, and narrow ravines give cougars plenty of cover for a surprise attack. That same year, in 2022, an even stranger scene was discovered in Washington. Forest Service employees reported finding the carcass of a cow elk with a cougar seen nearby. But when a biologist arrived, he found a dead adult female wolf lying beside the almost completely devoured elk. One of her legs was broken, and her injury suggested that the elk itself had kicked or trampled her during the hunt. Another body was found nearby. At first, the biologist assumed it was a coyote that had tried to approach the kill, but it turned out to be a small wolf pup. Judging by the tracks, the pack had managed to kill the elk, but the adult female wolf had died during the hunt. The other wolves remained near the carcass. Then the cougar arrived. It took the elk for itself and got rid of every other animal that stood in its way. Another species that may suffer as wolves return is the coyote. Before wolves returned to Yellowstone in 1995, coyotes had largely moved into the space they left behind. They lived in big family packs, hunted, and fed undisturbed on the remains of large animals. After wolves returned, the situation changed dramatically. Wolves began killing coyotes, especially when they approached carcasses left behind by wolf packs. At the same time, coyotes lost part of their territory and access to food. In northern Yellowstone, their population fell by almost half during the first few years, and wolves didn't even have to kill them. In areas with large number of wolves, there were about 1/3 fewer coyotes. They simply tried to stay away. Even the structure of their groups changed. Yellowstone coyotes had once formed packs of up to 7 animals, but after the wolves returned, they more often lived in ordinary family units, a breeding pair and their pups. Still, the wolves couldn't drive the coyotes out completely. After several years, their numbers began to rise again. The coyotes had simply learned to live alongside their new competitor. For some other animals, however, the return of wolves may actually be good news. That's because wolves leave behind the carcasses of large animals that scavengers often have no chance of killing on their own. In Yellowstone, this is easy to see when wolves bring down an elk. Ravens and magpies arrive at the carcass almost immediately. Coyotes appear next, lingering nearby and waiting for the wolves to finish eating. Bears are bolder. They may even try to drive the entire pack away from the kill. And the carcass continues feeding other animals long after the wolves have left. Eagles, ravens, bears, coyotes, and even insects all come to feed on it. In other words, a single successful hunt by a wolf pack can provide food for an entire crowd of other animals. But while a lone cougar may still be capable of killing a wolf, facing an entire pack's a different matter. In Yellowstone, wolves regularly find cougar kills and take them over. Researchers tracked both predators using GPS and discovered that nearly half of their encounters occurred near animals that had originally been killed by a cougar. By contrast, researchers observed a cougar stealing the wolf's prey only once. For cougars, this is a serious problem. A cougar hunts alone and may expend enormous energy bringing down a large elk, only to lose the carcass as soon as several wolves appear. That's why cougars in Yellowstone now tend to stay closer to trees, where they can quickly climb to safety if they encounter a pack. Smaller deer have also become more common among their prey, animals they can either eat quickly or drag up into a tree. And sometimes wolves take more than just the cougar's kill. Between 2016 and 2024, researchers recorded 2 cases in which a wolf pack killed an adult cougar. In both cases, there was no nearby tree for the feline to climb. The wolves didn't eat the cougar itself. Instead, they took the elk it had killed earlier. Recently, wolves were filmed for the first time displaying behavior that may qualify as tool use. Off the coast of British Columbia, people had been setting underwater traps for invasive green crabs. The traps contained bait, pieces of herring, and marine mammal meat. At some point, the traps began turning up damaged, and the bait regularly disappeared. So a camera was placed near one of them. In May 2024, it filmed a female wolf swimming toward the shore with the trap's float in her mouth. She dropped it on the beach, went back into the water, found the rope attached to the float, and began pulling it with her teeth. Little by little, the submerged trap moved closer to shore. The wolf then grabbed the trap, dragged it into the shallows, chewed through the netting, removed the bait container, and ate what was inside. And this wasn't the only recording. In February 2025, another camera captured a second wolf pulling on the rope of a submerged trap. Later, 2 of the traps were found on shore. Researchers were surprised that the wolf completed every step in the correct order, since it appears to be a fairly complex sequence of actions. But not all scientists are ready to call it true tool use. After all, the wolf didn't make the trap or modify it in any way. Still, it had to understand the connection between the float, the rope, the trap, and the food hidden inside, and that alone tells us quite a lot. But before long, the return of wolves created the very problem ranchers had predicted from the beginning. The wolves began attacking livestock. During the first 2 years after the animals were reintroduced, Colorado officials confirmed 66 incidents in which wolves killed or injured cattle and sheep. For ranchers, this is a serious problem. Cattle graze across enormous areas, sometimes covering many thousands of acres, so constantly watching the entire herd is simply impossible. That's why state officials decided to hire specially trained people to protect the livestock, range riders. They're essentially modern-day cowboys, whose job consists almost entirely of traveling alongside herds and driving wolves away. They patrol on horseback, on ATVs, or on foot, searching for wolf tracks and droppings, setting up trail cameras, and installing electric fencing. At night, they use thermal imaging devices to detect animals in the darkness. And when a wolf does approach the cattle, things start to look like a scene from a western. These riders carry special launchers that resemble paintball guns, but the projectiles are filled with capsaicin, the same substance that causes the burning sensation in pepper spray. The goal isn't to kill the wolf with these projectiles, it's to frighten the animal and teach it a simple association. Getting close to cattle leads to a very unpleasant experience. Loud noises, bright lights, and other deterrents are used as well. Riders aren't supposed to fire at a wolf that's simply passing through. The deterrent is deliberately linked to an attempt to approach the livestock. In the first year, Colorado hired 13 range riders and spent about $380,000 on their salaries alone. Officials plan to expand the program to around 20 people, although ranchers themselves doubted that this would be enough to cover millions upon millions of acres of grazing land. That raises an obvious question. Why chase wolves around with thermal cameras and pepper-filled projectiles at all? Why not simply shoot the animals that repeatedly attack livestock? With wolves, that approach may be more complicated than it seems. Normally, only one primary pair in a pack reproduces. The other animals help raise their offspring, hunt together, and maintain the family's social structure. If one of the breeding adults dies, especially the female, the pack may break apart. But the remaining wolves don't simply disappear. Some younger animals begin reproducing earlier or form new pairs. So the loss of breeding adults is partly offset by new ones taking their place. Researchers have indeed observed this effect, but that doesn't mean killing wolves causes their population to grow. When the parents die, the pack is more likely to break apart, reproduce less successfully, and raise fewer pups. It's simply that at the population level, the losses weren't as severe as researchers had expected. Other wolves moved in and occupied the newly available territory relatively quickly. That's why Colorado currently tries not to resort to shooting right away. First, the state sends a person to stand between the wolf and the herd, riding an ATV, carrying a thermal imaging device, and armed with a launcher filled with pepper projectiles. In neighboring Oregon, they came up with an even stranger solution. After wolves killed 11 cows in just 20 days, wildlife specialists began patrolling the pastures with drones. The drones were equipped with thermal cameras, powerful spotlights, and loudspeakers. Whenever a wolf got too close to the cattle, a drone would fly toward it and start making noise. And not just any noise. They blast AC/DC, Five-Finger Death Punch, recordings of gunshots and fireworks. They even play a scene from Noah Baumbach's Marriage Story in which Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver spend several minutes furiously screaming at each other. The researchers needed human voices with different pitches and the most aggressive delivery possible. And honestly, after hearing that, I'd probably run off into the woods too. The method proved surprisingly effective. During the first 85 days of drone patrols, wolves killed only 2 cows. There's one problem though. Some of the drones can stay airborne for only about 20 minutes, and during one nighttime pursuit, a drone worth roughly $20,000 crashed into a tree. But technology isn't the only thing that can influence wolf behavior. Sometimes all it takes is a parasite. Toxoplasma gondii is famous for one particularly bizarre effect. Since the parasite can reproduce only in cats, it has an advantage if its infected host becomes less afraid of them. As a result, infected rodents may stop avoiding cats as effectively, making them easier prey. In wolves, however, the effect appears to be quite different. Researchers studied wolves in Yellowstone for 26 years and tested 229 animals. They found that wolves infected with toxoplasmosis were 11 times more likely to leave their pack and set out in search of new territory. An infected wolf was also about 46 times more likely to become one of the pack's leaders. The most likely explanation is that infected wolves become bolder and more willing to take risks. For a wolf, that might mean leaving the pack it was born into and heading off to establish a territory of its own. And it appears that at least some of these infections come from cougars. Since the parasite reproduces in cats, wolves that spend more time in cougar territory were more likely to become infected. There have also been some unexpected findings. For example, bringing wolves back may actually make roads safer. Deer vehicle collisions are a serious problem in the United States. According to one estimate, these crashes kill around 200 people every year and cause more than $1 billion in property damage. But in Wisconsin, researchers noticed a strange pattern. They examined 22 years of data and found that after wolves returned to a county, the number of deer vehicle collisions fell by about 24%. And the decline wasn't simply because the wolves had eaten some of the deer. Wolves often travel along roads and trails because they're easier to move through. Deer notice this and start avoiding those areas. Biologists call this a landscape of fear. A wolf doesn't even need to be nearby. The deer only need to know that predators sometimes pass through. In fact, the reduction of the deer population accounts for only about 6% of the effect. The main reason is that deer simply became less likely to approach roads. For Wisconsin, that translates into savings of roughly $10.9 million a year. More recent estimates suggest that wolves may prevent around 1,100 deer vehicle collisions, 43 injuries, and 1 human death in the state every year. Interestingly, the wolves were brought back to Colorado in a rather unusual way. The decision wasn't made by scientists, national park officials, or even the state government. Ordinary voters made the call. In November 2020, people in Colorado were asked to decide whether wolves should be reintroduced. If a majority voted yes, state officials would have to develop a plan and begin relocating wolves by the end of 2023. The state was split almost exactly down the middle. A total of 50.91% of voters supported the return of wolves, while 49.09% opposed it. The difference was less than 2 percentage points. The voting map was especially interesting. Many rural counties in western Colorado, the very places where the wolves were expected to be released, voted against the measure. The decisive margin came from the more heavily populated urban areas in the eastern part of the state. In other words, people who would mostly live far from the wolf packs helped decide to bring them back to the places they themselves were unlikely ever to visit. Once Proposition 114 passed, the state wildlife agency had no choice. The law required it to develop a reintroduction program. And 3 years later, the first crates carrying wolves captured in Oregon were opened in the mountains of Colorado. But even an entire wolf pack doesn't always get to keep its kill. In Yellowstone, grizzlies regularly show up at elk killed by wolves. The wolves try to defend the carcass, surrounding the bear, lunging at it, and attempting to drive it away. Usually, however, it doesn't work. If a grizzly is determined to take the kill, the wolves generally give way. For the bear, someone else's carcass is an enormous helping of meat without the effort of chasing down and killing an adult elk. Sometimes a grizzly doesn't even wait for the hunt to end. In the fall of 2021, visitors in Yellowstone watched an adult bear fall in behind a pack that was chasing elk. The grizzly followed the wolves, waited for them to bring an animal down, and then simply walked over and claimed the carcass. The wolves had to wait until it had eaten its fill. And sometimes, even overwhelming numbers make no difference. In Yellowstone, observers once saw a single grizzly hold off 24 wolves at the same carcass. The pack kept trying to reach the elk, but the bear stood right over the kill and refused to let any of them near it. So the return of wolves has benefited grizzlies as well. The bears simply take a share of the wolves' kills. This happens from spring through fall, and when other high-calorie foods become scarce, carcasses left behind by wolves can be especially important to grizzlies. But the weirdest part of this entire story involves the ravens. In Yellowstone, ravens have long been seen near wolves. When a pack kills an elk, the birds appear around the carcass almost immediately. It's a very profitable arrangement for them. A raven has a hard time breaking through the thick hide of a large animal on its own, while the wolves do all the heavy work for it. For a long time, scientists therefore assumed that ravens simply followed wolf packs and waited for them to kill something. But in 2026, researchers decided to test that idea using GPS tracking. Over 2.5 years, they tracked 69 ravens and 20 wolves in Yellowstone. It turned out that ravens almost never follow wolves for long distances. Instead, they remember the places where packs most often make kills, then return to those locations again and again to check whether anything edible has appeared. During the entire study, researchers recorded only one case in which a raven actually followed a wolf for an extended period. Even so, ravens still reached nearly half of all known wolf kills within a week. Some flew in from more than 93 miles away. Their flight paths showed that the ravens weren't simply circling over the landscape looking for food. They often flew almost directly to places where they had previously found wolf kills. The researchers even created a map of these locations. Sure enough, the birds checked the areas where wolves had killed the most animals in the past more frequently. The return of wolves has even changed where the ravens spend their time. Today, many ravens in northern Yellowstone stay within wolf territories, away from people, even though most of them previously fed closer to human settlements. As for the humans, they don't even have to deliberately interfere in the relationships between predators. Sometimes simply building a road, a farm, or a settlement is enough. As part of the Washington Predator Prey Project, researchers spent several years using GPS collars to track wolves, cougars, elk, coyotes, and bobcats. And this was hardly untouched wilderness. The forests were broken up by farmland, pastures, logging sites, roads, and residential development. The animals began using the human presence against one another. Elk, for example, avoided people during the day. But at night, areas with human activity could become a kind of refuge from wolves, since the wolves themselves tended to keep their distance from people. That strategy was much less effective against cougars. Coyotes and bobcats took the idea even further. Whenever wolves or cougars appeared nearby, they moved into areas where the level of human influence was roughly twice as high as before. In other words, farms, roads, and settlements effectively became shelters from larger predators. The problem was that these shelters were dangerous in their own right. Humans kill coyotes and bobcats 3 to 4 times more often than wolves and cougars do. Some are shot after attacking livestock or poultry, while others are killed by hunters or caught in traps. And sometimes the conflict between humans and wolves turned into something resembling a criminal investigation. In 2016, law enforcement agents with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service received a tip that someone was leaving poisoned meatballs beside a cow carcass in a national forest in New Mexico. The location had been chosen deliberately. The smell of a dead animal could draw in wolves and other predators, while the poisoned bait was waiting nearby. The investigation led agents to a local rancher named Craig Thiessen. They soon discovered that the poisoned meatballs were only part of the story. A year earlier, Mexican gray wolf number 1385 had been found dead nearby. Someone had attached a magnet to its GPS collar and wrapped the electronics in electrical tape to stop the collar from transmitting a signal. Thiessen later admitted that he had trapped the wolf and beaten it to death with a shovel. In 2018, he pleaded guilty to violating the Endangered Species Act. Documents released later showed that he had also told investigators about other wolves he'd trapped and beaten before releasing them. And the Mexican gray wolf wasn't simply a nuisance animal that ranchers were allowed to kill on sight. It belongs to one of the rarest wolf populations in North America, a population the federal government has been working to restore to the wild since the late 1990s. See you later.